The Army doesn't like more than one disaster in a day.
Looks bad in the newspapers and upset civilians at their breakfast.
I'm Bill Buford. Welcome to WarNotes, a conflict podcast in which we will be taking a journey into history, discussing contemporary events, and even doing some conflict futurism. We'll be examining this violent and calamitous clash and collision between complex adaptive systems armed to the teeth to see who will prevail and see what it tells us about the human condition and why we can't stop. Hello, this is Bill, and welcome to episode 8 of WarNotes, a conflict podcast. This episode is entitled Fixing Fight Club, Reimagining Land Warfare or Else. And in this one, I'm going to tackle the U.S. Army for the most part, maybe elements of the Special Operations Command. This episode will dovetail nicely with episode 07, the previous one, Fixing Fight Club, Kill the Core, where I proposed, as much as it hurts my heart to say so, it is time for the U.S. Marine Corps to be removed from the inventory, furl the flags, render the honors, and give many thanks for what the Corps has done in the past, and consign it to where it belongs now, which is in the dustbin of martial history. A little bit of housekeeping. I was enlisted in the Navy, and then I got out, remained in the reserves, and went to college, wanting to get my commission in the Army in order to avoid sea duty, because I figured, well, at least I won't be haze gray and underway, and I won't be deployed as much. Well, I discovered otherwise once I affiliated with the Army. In the Army, I was combat arms for 4 years in a branch detail program for young officers, in which one spent 4 years in combat arms. I was with 3rd of the 502nd in the illustrious 101st Airborne Division, after which I went to my captain's course to transition into military intelligence. And from that point until my retirement, I served as an intelligence functionary, everything from an S2 SIO to an MID det commander to a variety of other things, serving up at the Army level in various positions in light infantry, airborne, air assault, and special forces formations. So I think that I come to this with a little bit of tribal knowledge about the way the Army works in a fundamental and functional fashion. As all of my listeners from both Chasing Ghost and Irregular Warfare podcast and this companion podcast, WarNotes, know, there are several drums that I persistently beat. And among those is that the U.S. Army and its allied and coalition nations in Europe and the Pacific are not prepared for 21st century near-peer and peer conflict for a wide variety of reasons, to include the fact that for those brand new to this podcast and you happen to have tuned in and you've never listened to anything else that I've talked about, I always try to provide an explanatory framework for warfare in the past, in the present, and as a conflict futurist, examining what it's going to look like in the future. But there are some things when it comes to human warfare and conflict that seems to be features, not bugs, that animate and illustrate what it's all about. One of those is that all conflicts and all wars are a very chaotic collision between complex adaptive systems, and through friction and fog, that Clausewitzian roll of the dice of things that are going to go awry with the plans that happen left of bang, things are not going to go the way either army perceives them to be, whether that perception is merely fiction or reality. The 21st century, when it comes to conflict, is a raft of revolutions and military affairs. Those things that are so gobsmackingly new and brilliant and really throwing a monkey wrench into way military thinkers have thunk for the past decades or hundreds of years. That is going to throw a Crises of indecision and panic for a variety of reasons. I'm going to elucidate 3 of those reasons, and while I tell you these 3, it doesn't mean that there aren't others, because there are. These may be flashpoints, these may be origins, these may be root causes, these may be proximate causes, but from these will blossom other problem sets that are going to make themselves very evident in the next near-peer or peer clash. Those 3 things are autonomous targeting, robotics, and hypervelocity munitions in both a defensive and offensive framework in everything in between. War tends to be combinatorial. War tends to be something in which all of a sudden technology of yesterday is all of a sudden very much the technology of yesterday because it has been superseded. As I've mentioned in previous podcasts, on December 8th, 1941, many naval admirals and naval intelligentsia planet-wide were scratching their heads and thinking, it appears that the battleship in which we have sunk so much blood, treasure, and capital may not be the be-all and end-all of the decisive naval battle that we had envisioned before as a result of the brilliant naval aviation techniques, tactics, and procedures and employment by the Japanese in December of that year, and from December through March of 1942, employing what was a centrifugal strategy throughout Southeast Asia and those countries proximate to Japan proper, were caught up in this brilliant 4-month whirlwind of contemporaneous strategy that encompassed the downfall of the Dutch, the English, the Australians, and the U.S. in that brief period of time. Now, mind you, then we find ourselves in 1942. Then there's the Battle of Midway, and all of a sudden, naval aviation becomes the premier and center of gravity nexus for U.S. naval power during that time. And between the summer of 1942 and August of 1945, as James Hornfisher alluded to in a number of his books, the U.S. Navy and the U.S. and some of the allies, the British and the Australians, for instance, but the U.S. Navy put their shoulders to the wheel and provided the most strength and effort in this, were the ones who built a literal seaborne civilization from the coast of California to the shores of Japan, starting in Okinawa in April of 1945. Now, the reason I took you on that brief trip down memory road is to show you that in a mere 4 years' time, the entire framework and realization and practicum of the military professional planet-wide changed in such a fundamental fashion that was probably one of the most rapid changes militarily in human conflict history. And now we fast forward to today in the 21st century, and I would offer to you in the best Rod Serling fashion, picture, if you will, the United States and its allies spending literally over $1 trillion a year combined on their defense, and they find that in the end, they will be bested by the BRICS countries such as China, Russia, and other regional hegemons who have made what I would consider the proper investments in 21st century warfare instead of the American penchant for always fighting the last war and fighting it rather poorly after that war has ceased to exist. One of the charters of critical thinking is that you have to be prismatic in your thinking in which you red team yourself. You entertain counterfactuals. You entertain the 10th man in the room who says, you know what, maybe you're not as smart as you think you are. Maybe you could consider the alternatives to your thinking or possible violations of logic and rationality in all the syllogisms that you've created to come to the conclusions that you have. And I think that there has been a massive fart bubble in the Pentagon in the last 5 decades, predictably, after the denouement of the Vietnam War and the last vestiges of conventional fighting in 1991 with the Persian Gulf War that lasted for probably, one could speculate, 2 months, with the eradication, mind you, the minor eradication of a portion of the Iraqi army at that time. And many will question me when I say that America hasn't had a military victory since 1945. And some will say, well, but in 1991, Bill, with the Operation Desert Storm, it was brilliant. It was amazing. They took some of the better aspects of contemporary thinking to include the Liddell Hart's indirect approach, which means that one doesn't do head-on collisions with other armies. One goes around their flanks and into their rear, and you compromise their maneuver, and you place them in a destruction or neutralization phase in place. Well, yes, they're correct. If America won and the West won in that war, why did they return in 2003? By the way, the answer to that question I just posed you is not as easy as you think, because when you think about it from a geopolitical perspective, there was no reason to go into Iraq in 2003 because they had nothing whatsoever to do with 911. But that was one of 21 casus belli, which would see General Colin Powell before the UN fabricating and fictionalizing the existence of things, in this case, yellow cake, that simply didn't exist in Iraq, as a reason to go to war there and get caught in that quagmire, in addition to the quagmire in Afghanistan, in addition to the other quagmires in Libya, in Yemen, now Syria, on and on and on, proving once again that while an army can fight conventionally, possibly in the last war, in this war it will always pay the piper in blood and learning debits because they weren't paying attention to what was happening in the world around them during that time. So I have a number of propositions for you. And one of the propositions is what one could call a rhetorical question. And that would be this, meaning that I don't necessarily have the answer. I have some ideas, but I don't have a definitive answer. And one of those questions is this: is an army that is designed to fight insurgencies, third world countries, developing countries, getting involved in one way and picking a fight and picking sides, by the way, in a conflict like Afghanistan, like Iraq, like Libya, and on and on. Can you have an army that is conventionally designed? Can that army successfully neutralize or defeat insurgents? As I have entertained in Chasing Ghost, an Irregular Warfare podcast, to which WarNotes is a companion podcast, and by the way, I've invested much more time, treasure, reading, thinking into Chasing Ghost than this one, is that America has done extraordinarily poorly at counterinsurgency. And of course, one of the reasons I think that is because from an anti-fragile fragility perspective, and I recommend that you listen to episodes 2 and 4 of my Chasing Ghost podcast if you want a deep dive examination into the nature of anti-fragility and fragility in both conventional warfare and irregular warfare, is that most, if not all, insurgencies tend to be anti-fragile for a variety of reasons that we won't entertain here for lack of time, and that most, if not all, counterinsurgencies tend to be fragile. The insurgents, for the most part, live there, except for auxiliaries, like when we saw instances of foreign mujahideen going into Afghanistan from other countries to fight alongside their indigenous brethren against the great invaders, whoever they happened to be at the time, because from 1835 until recently, the British and the Americans and the Russians, in a brief 10-year interregnum, attempted to wrestle to the ground the insurgents in Afghanistan and didn't succeed very well. But for the most part, insurgents will never give up. And when one puts an Islamic flavor to any of that, I guarantee you, and some demographer out there has a better percentage than me, but I'm going to put a mark on the wall, there will be 10% of a given male population who will never, ever give up fighting an invasion and an occupation by a foreign invader that comes into the country. So the original question is, can you have a force, in this case, 500,000, can you have a force, the Army, the U.S. Army, Marines, smaller contingents of U.S. Air Force and U.S. Navy fighting that and maintaining their unconscious competence and conscious competence and capabilities and constant improvement in tactics, techniques, and procedures TTP, which is the lifeblood and DNA of evolving armies that get stronger and smarter on their feet as they continue a given fight. Can that same force that has acquainted and acclimated itself to that particular fight in a conventional war against near-peer and peer foes and do so with success and prevail or get a stalemate out of the deal against those sophisticated armies? That is an open question. Now, my own preliminary answer, to which I am subject to superior evidence that reframes what I'm saying, and I'll get in that debate and that discussion gladly, because I'm always trying to get the single most accurate picture of what the right answer is that America and its allies don't do counterinsurgency in irregular warfare to a large extent very well at all, and that since 1991, instead of that mark in the wall I put in between 1972 and 1975 in Vietnam, where you did have large-scale conventional operations, but there were also conventional operations that were assisted maybe in parallel by special operations that were conducted in Vietnam and such. It wasn't done well. As a matter of fact, after 1945, a war that crushed the Germans as a result of the Russians, not the Americans, because the Americans and the Allies were a sideshow in 44 and 45, and they were nothing next to the constant grind against the Germans by the Russians, to which the Germans devoted 4/5 of their entire order of battle from the summer of 1941 until the German surrender in May of 1945. So my answer to you right here, right now, is that not only is the U.S. Army, and I'll always say as an addendum, its associated allied and coalition members in Europe, NATO, and in PACOM with the Pacific allies in Japan, South Korea, and various territories that are out there that America happens to occupy, like Guam, and then lesser allies who are on the fence allies like the Philippines and such. America simply isn't ready for that conventional fight for a variety of reasons. Now remember, this entire Fixing Fight Club series is devoted to my reimagination and my gentle jousting against the DoD and the Pentagon and the present overwhelming majority defense intelligentsia in the West, the U.S. primarily, that says that, oh yes, everything is well and good. The entire formation and problem set of fighting peer and near-peer fights, the American conventional armed forces are ready for it. In this particular episode, I'm going to be tackling the U.S. Army. And the answer is no. The U.S. is not ready, and the U.S. Army is not ready. They're not prepared for that conventional fight. And I'll tell you, one of the reasons that they're not prepared for that conventional fight is because the U.S. Army and the other forces have this almost childlike reverence for the power of exquisite platforms, everything from aircraft carriers to sophisticated aircraft to manned tanks to manned infantry fighting vehicles to armored artillery pieces to all of these things. And by the way, all of those are unmarried to a sophisticated fire synchronization scheme within the Army itself, much less the Army connected to other organizations in the conduct of a near-peer or peer fight, where they can actually, in a deliberate or hasty fashion, and the bifurcation thereof is that deliberate is registered targets, ones that one has planned on left of bang, that you will prosecute with mathematical precision, and hasty would be meeting engagements occur, combat ensues, and from the company level to the platoon to everything in between, and then all the way up to brigade and regiment and division, the clash occurs, and that synchronization simply isn't there. The Army and the Air Force have been playing at ABMS, the Advanced Battle Management System. This is the U.S. Air Force's latest effort to create a next-generation command and control system. They wanted to make sure that this program is a contribution to the DoD's Joint All-Domain Command and Control, which is JADC2, and it's an effort on modernizing DoD decision-making processes for combat operations. That's what they say it is, but in the end, what this has to come down to is proper fire synchronization. And as I discussed in detail in episode 6, the one prior to the one where I said we need to kill the core, Fixing Fight Club, Escalation Dominance, and Salvo Competition, I discuss in detail why the Russians have broken the code on how this is done, and they will share that with their fellow regional hegemon China, and they will have that sophisticated capability to put metal on target in deliberate and hasty fires that are synchronized at a molecular level in less than a minute, which has been their ambition since 2008, for which they have broken the code since 2018. None of this is fixed. So for those of you not acquainted with what Army formations look like, I wanted to go over that very quickly. I know this is going to sound like math on air, but bear with me. In the present-day Army, there's 452,000 active duty troops. There were nearly 500,000 when I was in the 1990s. And there's 325,000 in the Army National Guard, which comprises the combat arms formations. In Army, you have combat arms, combat support, and combat service support. And those last two would be the non-trigger pullers. And then you have 176,000 in the Army Reserve. And the Army Reserve tends to be combat support and combat service support. I haven't conducted the survey to see if there has been a shift in the complement of forces in there and whether they're favoring combat arms more so than they used to, but I don't know. There are 265,000 civilian personnel in the Department of the Army. I think the Army fields approximately 4,400 crewed aircraft, of which the majority of those are rotary wing, very few are fixed wing aircraft. And those fixed wing aircraft, which probably number in the hundreds, if that, are for shuttling our perfume prince generals about, and also for certain ISR, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance needs that are served by fixed-wing aircraft, which are assigned organically to the Army. All of this is a result of the 1947-48 Key West Agreement, in which you had the revolt of the admirals and various other things, where once the Air Force was established, the Air Force wanted to ensure that their fixed-wing rice bowl, in which they would have the proponency and majority of fixed-wing assets that were not carrier-borne or necessarily naval aircraft under their wings, as it were, and that the Army would be restricted to flying, for the most part, rotary wing aircraft. Most of those rotary wing aircraft would be UH-60s, very few Bell Hueys, which the UH-60s replaced. The CH-47 dual-rotored helicopters, the fastest in the inventory, by the way. They're the ones that look like two palm trees raping a dumpster. And then, of course, you have the H-64s and then a few scout helicopters. By the way, helicopters are very vulnerable, extraordinarily vulnerable. I would point you to the 2003 Battle of Karbala in Iraq, in which the vaunted H-64 attack helicopters suffered 30 casualties, to include both by fire and mechanical casualties, in the very early part of the Iraq War, as a result of what I would suggest is their fragility in combat when exposed to ground fire. By the way, this very thing will play a key part in the analytical framework that I'm laying out. Now, playing combat arms kabuki is a tricky affair because there's something called tooth to tail. And what tooth to tail is that's how many folks support the trigger pullers. Now, ordinarily in Western forces, that's between 8 and 12 to 1. We're going to call it 10 to 1, which means that for every infantryman, in this case an 11 Bravo or an 11 Charlie, the 11 Bravo is the light fighter infantryman, and the 11 Charlie is the indirect fires infantryman. By the way, you can be an 11 Bravo and an 11 Charlie, but just because you're an 11 Bravo won't make you an indirect fire specialty. Hence, you have the 11 Charlies there to be mortarmen, javelinmen, and the rest of the things that are very effective combat multipliers for a light division. A light division is one that ends up on the ground, and they just so happen to use their leather personnel carriers, their boots, to get to and from where they need to be and to close with the enemy, conduct fire maneuver, and neutralize or destroy said enemy once they arrive in a deliberate or hasty meeting engagement. So 11 Bravos and 11 Charlies, the 0311s, and that MOS is its alter ego in the Marine Corps. They're about 10% of the total Army, so let's call it, for math reasons, 452,000 active Army folks. We're going to call trigger pullers 50,000. Happy to be corrected by audience members who have a much more accurate bead on what that precise number would be. So about 25% is combat arms. Now, combat arms in the U.S. Army is going to be armor, it's going to be aviation, it's going to be infantry, it's going to be field artillery, and then, of course, your 18 series, which is going to be special forces, or, by extension, the 11 Bravos who happen to be airborne qualified that are in the 82nd Airborne Division or Ranger Regiment. So if I may, let me acquaint you with some numbers on how armies are formed in the West. You have a team with 4 soldiers. You have a squad with 10 soldiers. You have a platoon with 36 soldiers. You have a company with 200 soldiers. You have a battalion with 1,000 soldiers. You have a brigade with 5,000 soldiers. By the way, brigade and regiment can sometimes be used interchangeably when you see this, and that's 5,000 soldiers in each of those. What makes this an important distinction is not only our regimental combat teams and brigade combat teams, but for the most part, because of a variety of experiments that were conducted in the Army since the end of World War II at the division level, they try to find what is the most effective tactical team that is either expeditionary or, in the case of a near peer fight, is going to be able to operate independently, sort of, and the Marines have pioneered this to a large extent, in a combat arms team, which is what a brigade combat team is, because they employ something the Army and the DoD finally refers to as task organization, which is where you look at the fight at hand, you've done all the necessary analytics, the decision-making has been solidified, it's all been approved at the upper echelons, and you send a task-organized brigade combat team. In this case, it would probably exceed 5,000 soldiers and approach 10,000 soldiers, because on that combat team, maybe you would have a battalion or a battalion minus of helicopters assigned for either ferrying or combat air support, or you would have artillery support that would not necessarily be organic to that brigade combat team, that would come from the division and above level to give larger caliber weapons or missile weapons that they don't happen to have in their modified table of organization equipment that they practice in peacetime. Let's go on. The division will have about 15,000 soldiers. The Corps, under which you will have 2 to 5 divisions, will be 45,000. A field army, and these things haven't existed since World War II, will be 4+ divisions, 90,000 soldiers. Now, by the way, I said it hasn't existed since World War II. That is in combat. Administratively, of course, all these have existed. But has a field army been tested in combat, much less a corps? It has not. One could charitably say that it sort of looked like that in the Persian Gulf War in 1991. One could make that case, but they didn't really fight a foe that required them to act in a fashion that was agile and logistically challenging. And above that, you have what would be called army groups, which is 4 to 5 field armies. This is 400,000 soldiers. And then you would have Army Regional, which would be 3+ field armies. Million. None of this has been seen since the end of World War II. Arguably, the Chinese may have fielded groups and field armies during the Korean War, but since that time, we have not seen that kind of numerical multiplicity, as it were, of armies in combat. The Army's been doing some silly stuff when it comes to divisions. That combined arms focus happened as a result of World War II. Then you had the Pentomic Division in the 1950s, which was in response to the nuclear threat, and that didn't pan out because they were talking about survivability on a nuclear battlefield, which, by the way, in the 21st century, does become an organizing activity one should be interested in at least extrapolating. You had the Road, which was the reorganized Objective Army Division. And then you had the brigade combat teams I talked about. Now, what's interesting about all of this is that they're going back to divisional structures. There was talk in Division 21 of floating divisional commands, and these things are huge. These are thousands of soldiers that are in administrative functions to orchestrate and conduct all of the operations below them with the BCTs. And it doesn't quite pass the smell test to have a division commander, in this case, a 2-star general, who has an airborne background or an air assault background, as in the 101st, or a light infantry background, or a mechanized infantry background, or an armor background, as in the armor brigade combat teams, the ABCTs, and such. And all of a sudden, he is given this composite force, or maybe even simply an air assault airborne combination. He happens to be a heavy division, a heavy combat arms guy for most of his life, where he spent so much time around the mech infantry and tanks. Does he know how to properly fight those airborne and air assault troops? Is the converse correct, that a heavy division commander, or who has assumed that function, who has career experience with armor and with mech infantry formations, would he be able to properly fight those airborne and air assault formations? Maybe, maybe not. I have been pounding the drum about the exquisite platform fixation within the U.S. Army, within the DoD, within the Pentagon, and this stretches across to all of the services, that whether it's the carrier or the Zumwalt or the little crappy ship in the U.S. Navy, or the disastrous F-35 program in the U.S. Air Force, or this interesting desire on the part of the Army to constantly improve the manned tank that is also the crossbow and chariot of the 21st century battlefield. This exquisite platform fixation is going to drive all of the U.S. Armed Forces in a near-peer or peer fight to decimation, neutralization, and destruction, and nothing else, unless they embrace what is the revolution in military affairs for this particular war century, and that would be robotics, hypervelocity munitions, the autonomous targeting that I talked about, and the fact that the salvo competition, which means that the kind of war of leakers that all combatants in near-peer and peer fights are going to experience. And we're seeing this in the third world and developing countries, by the way. We're seeing the way the U.S. Navy, with its august carrier forces and the massive armadas that are needed to get those 10 aircraft off the ship, penetrate whatever kind of integrated air missile defense activities are engaged in by the threat, penetrate those, deliver their minuscule payloads, and then come back alive, that you've seen the Houthis in Yemen have no navy to speak of. I think that their latest naval watercraft are Russian patrol boats that are 1975 vintage, but they have chased a carrier group or 2 or 3 out of the Red Sea as a result of the threat that they've imposed on those organizations. Because in salvo competition, it is a war of leakers, because something's going to get through. And when that something gets through on an exquisite platform, it's very difficult to replace those, especially in the acquisition and manufacturing environment that is the West in this year of 2025. So the Army in the 21st century has gone through 4 major dynamic realignments within itself since the beginning of the 21st century. In 2003, we had the modular Army, self-explanatory. 2012, Army drawdown and restructuring as a result of the spankings, defeats, stalemates, and just downright martial incompetence of the U.S. Army in all the wars it was engaged in Afghanistan, Iraq, the Horn of Africa, and the beginnings of the others in Libya, Syria, and Yemen later on after 2012, in 2014 and 16. In 2017, there were the Army Force Structure Decisions, and in 2018, there was the Army's Aim Point and Army 2030 Force Structure Initiatives. I am not going to bore you with the details, but here's something that I've discovered in my forecasting, because you won't find me predicting because of the evidentiary burden of that. You will find me forecasting on occasion, because I find that the evidentiary load on forecasting is less burdensome than predictions. They're going to go through more of these. They're going to make more fancy PowerPoint slides. As a matter of fact, if PowerPoint slides won wars, the U.S. would be the preeminent military power on Earth. I'm going to quote from the Congressional Research Service document, the 2024 Army Force Structure Transformation Initiative. I read these so that you don't have to, but I will put the document in the show notes. And what it reads here is, quote, on February 27, 2024, the Army publicly announced changes to its force structure that will modernize and continue to transform the service to better face future threats. Under the plan, the Army will reorganize over the next decade to ensure it can deliver trained, cohesive, and lethal forces to meet future challenges in increasingly complex operational environments. In conjunction with this announcement, the Army published Army White Paper, Army Force Structure Transformation. As part of this transformation, the Army plans to develop new multi-domain task forces, indirect fire protection capability battalions, counter small unmanned aerial system batteries, and maneuver short-range air defense battalions. End of quote. This is all well and good. This is all intent. This is all ambition. Ambition is cheap. We'll see what happens. They've spent the last 10 to 15 years on this multi-domain business where they say that we're going to field these battalions, brigades, and division minus combat teams that will be able to service a variety of many things, not doing much good at all on an individual basis, not able to focus on core warfighting attributes that would keep the Army alive and effective in the 21st century. By the way, when you read that paper, what you'll discover is that there's a very interesting infographic in it that talks about levels of organization and command of U.S. Army units. And as I mentioned earlier, where I talked about Corps and Army and then going to field armies and such, what they use here is the term theater. So an operational theater is established to support one or more corps, usually two, and includes numerous support brigades and support commands, end of quote. And what that's all about is that the entire planet, since America is a global hegemon, is divided into these various commodity commands that are overseen by flag officers, and they are held responsible for whatever either deliberate or hasty warfighting has to take place within their respective theater. For instance, you have Central Command, which is going to be the one that covers the Middle East for the most part, and you will have Pacific Command, which of course covers the Pacific and all of those contiguous nation states to that body of water. Now, in that same report, in 2018, the Army strategy stated that, quote, the Army strategy at the time articulates how the total Army achieves its objectives defined by the Army vision and fulfills its Title X duties. Its primary inputs are the National Security Strategy, the National Defense Strategy, and the National Military Strategy. End of quote. I would tell you that those three documents that come out in 3, 4, 5 year increments tend to be a lot of word salad and fuzzy and politically correct laden verbosity that describes the happy and joyous unicorn-filled universe that they wish to make happen in the next few years. Very rarely do those documents state in a superlative and straightforward fashion what one needs to do to make these necessary transformations to meet what future conflict looks like. Now, the cost is going to be burdensome, of course, and they cover that in here, but what I found interesting was the transformation timeline. Quote, the Army White Paper, Army Force Structure Transformation, establishes a plan for personnel-related initiatives by fiscal year 2029, but it does not address in any level of detail a timeline for transforming the force structure. Based on reports and statements from the Army, some of these force structure changes have already occurred, but for other units, the timeline for transformation, whether for reducing current force structure or establishing new units, is widely known. As with the case of an estimated total cost, a detailed understanding of the Army's planned transformation timeline could prove beneficial to effective congressional oversight of the Army's transformation initiative and proposed cab force structure changes. End of quote. Now, mind you, what's going to happen here, this is my forecast, is that the same with the future combat vehicle nonsense that occurred just after the cusp of the 21st century, the Army would spend tens of billions of dollars to end up canceling the programs that it had established to replace existing vehicles in the formations to include the Humvee. And that turned out to be an unmitigated disaster. And apparently, not taking into account what happened with the Navy follies with their shipbuilding since 1991, which has been an unmitigated and very costly disaster with 3 ship classes, the little crappy ship, the Zumwalt, and the new carrier, the Ford, and the Ford class, to replace the aging Nimitz supercarriers. They're doing the concurrent technology nonsense again. Concurrent technology in this case is where you take an unproven technology, one that hasn't even made it out the door as far as feasibility and effectiveness, and making claims that that is going to be a major part, a leg of the chair, a major component of what's going to make these nascent and future combat formations so effective. I quote, some units, such as the LRHW batteries and directed energy SHORAD units, that would be short-range air defense, do not have mature weapons and technologies. Furthermore, all units require different types of equipment, including radars and vehicles for transportation and support. Given the many challenges of equipping new units, Congress could explore with the Army its plans for equipping units over time. Such an examination might include when the Army's new units are planned to achieve, and this is very important, initial operational capability, IOC, and when they are expected to reach full operational capability. Now, what that means is that initial operational capability is when a weapon system comes out and all of a sudden, it works at the singleton level. What full operational capability means is that you have all of these singletons together in coherent formations or amalgamations of force, and that they all work together relatively seamlessly. That would be full operational capability. By the way, the F-35 took nearly 20 years to reach that point from its incipient dream life in 2001. My forecast, none of this is going to work out as planned. It will be an unmitigated disaster. They will keep shifting to the right by years, and costs will skyrocket for all of this, ending in... Now, mind you, when it came to the Future Combat System that I just referred to, that was formally launched in 2003, but it had been a DARPA program that in 2001 was funded $5.5 million to 8 teams to develop unmanned ground combat vehicles, UGCVs. In May 2003, the DoD commenced the development and demonstration phase in a $15 billion contract. As planned, FCS, Future Combat Systems, included the network, the unattended ground sensors, the unmanned aerial vehicles, the unmanned ground vehicles, and the 8 manned ground vehicles for which these would serve as loyal wingmen. A spiral model was planned for that FCS development and upgrade. As of 2004, FCS was in a system development and demonstration phase. Well, we go on, and then we fast forward, and all of a sudden we discover after $30 billion is spent, by 2009, he announced plans to cut FCS spending, in this case Robert Gates in the Obama administration, as part of a shift toward spending more on counterterrorism and less to prepare for conventional warfare. Now picture 2009, midst of Afghanistan and Iraq, and the new way of fighting there that was going on, unsuccessful, of course. And then, of course, they're saying, you know what, maybe we shouldn't spend any intellectual or defense capital on conventional warfare. And, of course, this also led to canceling the series of manned ground vehicles. I'm all about that. I think that was a great idea. In May 2009, the proposed DoD budget for fiscal year 2010 had minimal funding for manned ground combat vehicles and for the future combat vehicle system, and the service was to restructure that FCS so more Army units were supported. And of course, 23 June 2009, they canceled the Future Combat Systems program and replaced it with separate programs under the Army Brigade Combat Team Modernization umbrella. $30 billion was spent. On the bright side, the Defense Intelligentsia at the time, even though they were stymied in doing this, were starting to tackle what was one of the most important things that any modern land force can do, and that's how do we take unmanned modality, mud to space, or mud to near space in this case. Most of these are going to be air-breathing vehicles for the most part, except for persistent third-party targeting that would be done by UAVs, possibly by satellites, but that's not within the portfolio of this program to examine. And by the way, that Army Brigade Combat Team Modernization program also turned out to be a false start. It was, from 2009 to 2010, the Principal Modernization Program. It was the successor, and a key goal was to, I guess, improve upon what they thought they had discovered in FCS, but all of it has fizzled, and I've seen nothing of record come out of it. I remember being in Afghanistan. I spent nearly 2 years there in both Kabul and Mazar-e-Sharif in the north, and one person had cynically stated, you know what, it seems like everything that we're doing over here is a sophisticated money laundering operation for the military-industrial complex. At the time, 2013 and 2015, I thought, food for thought, but I didn't buy into it. Now, I find that scenario more and more compelling when I look at the history of acquisition programs in the DoD. You find that when it comes to Army modernization, and when I say Army modernization, just use that as a totem for U.S. Army, that time after time they have adopted means which didn't lead to much substantial change. Now, there have been some Army successes. I don't want to be the harbinger of doom and gloom and a reporter on successive Army failures. In this case, for instance, the introduction of the Gore-Tex gear that was given to soldiers in the 1980s and 90s. I thought it was extraordinary in what it did for the modern infantrymen and combat arms and combat support folks who were in the field. When one looks at the Javelin system, for instance, you find that what an extraordinary anti-tank weapon system that was incredibly effective, not only in the direct fire mode where you could see your target, but if your target, let's suppose it was a tank or an armored vehicle or a lightly skinned vehicle that happened to be behind a reverse military slope, not visible to you, you could aim it at where you supposed it was, even though you can't see it, but you had a very good supposition of where it was. The Javelin would fire straight, arc up in a parabola, at the top of parabola, tip in apogee, and land on the roof or ceiling of whatever it was you were firing at. Brilliant. When the Stinger came out in the 1980s and the 1990s, and what it could do, especially the RMP variant, which was the 360-degree acquisition of thermal sources that it would zero in on, a brilliant manpad, a brilliant man-portable anti-aircraft system. Of course, it stopped cold in 2003. And the Army said, as you can see from what I alluded to earlier, when they talked about, well, let's take this conventional program because we're fighting these wars in Afghanistan and Iraq and concentrate on counterterrorism and counterinsurgency, much to the demise of the advancement of conventional weapon systems. Since 2003 and the alarm bells going on in 2018 and 2019, and then with the Russian special military operation into the Ukraine, showing that all of a sudden America's air dominance, air superiority, air supremacy, all three of those factors were in the hazard, and that the most scattered and low-density troops would have to have a SAFADS, a small arms air defense system, or a MANPADS, a man-portable passive acquisition air defense system, and all of a sudden they're discovering that once you gave all of these Stingers to the Ukrainians and you had to rebuild the magazines that had been emptied out in America, some of the major manufacturers discovered that they didn't quite have all the technology still that they had before to build them up to that peak in 2003 for a variety of reasons, to include engineers retiring out and bringing their experiential databases and intuition engines with them, where they couldn't be built again, and the rare earth element crisis that has pretty much smoldered across the West, that's really going to come to the fore in the next 10 years because of the BRICS countries saying, we've got a lot of those rare earth metals and maybe we'll stop sharing. The Army has to clean house. They must reduce the number of general officers they have. They must revisit with fervor and absolute brutal integrity the very reason these divisions exist. For instance, you will find that manned tanks are the chariot and crossbow of the 20th century, and we have divisions devoted and built around manned tanks. Ukraine will tell you that is not a good idea. The same applies to the mechanized infantry, those 11 Bravos and Charlies, who happen to go to war in Bradleys or infantry fighting vehicles of one variety or another, also targeted by UASs and UAVs in that salvo competition that I alluded to earlier, in which the war of leakers will mean that $50,000 to $30,000 Russian or Iranian Lancet is going to land in your lap through the open hatch of the vehicle that you're driving on the battlefield and explode and turn everybody inside into human gummy bears. Now, mind you, this same thing applies to other exquisite platforms in the U.S. Army, in this case, the H-64s, the UH-60s, the CH-47s, and the MH special operations variants of these, which tend to be the penetrator aircraft, the stealthier aircraft. Notice I said stealthier, not stealthy, because stealth doesn't exist with any near-peer or peer competitor that happens to have long-range and long-wave radar, because stealth can still, despite its small radar cross-section, be detected and declared. It's time to rethink armored formations, the armored brigade combat teams. It's also time to rethink the infantrymen in the 21st century, because here's another thing that's been discovered. Those FPVs, those UAVs, those Lancets, all the variants of unmanned aircraft that are being weaponized, whether they're used for third-party targeting by persistently loitering over the battlefield and directing incoming artillery. Remember what I talked about when it comes to the 21st century permutation of artillery. What you have to consider is that, and the Russians have done this because the center of gravity for their entire armed forces isn't aircraft, it's artillery. They have simply taken the FPVs, UAVs, UASs, and all of these unmanned aerial vehicles and modalities and declared them to be part of the artillery mix in their fire synchronization matrix to put metal on target. In a cursory examination of the battlefield, what one discovers in the Ukraine, for instance, and you can also see hints of this in the fall of 2020 in between Azerbaijan and Armenia in Nagorno-Karabakh, where you see that there's these UASs in that salvo competition are starting to take on a primacy, mind you, a supremacy, and being able to neutralize or destroy whatever happens to be crawling across the ground. So we have to re-examine those armored formations. We have to re-examine light infantry formations. We have to re-examine how infantrymen are delivered to the battlefield. For instance, what most paratrooper formations around the world have discovered, and America maintains outside of Russia some of the largest parachute formations, in this case, the 82nd Airborne Division, which has between 12 and 18,000 troops, depending on what source you look at, and has an entire brigade, which would be 4,000 minus troops, I suspect, who would be on airborne call. Airborne in this case would be an airborne insertion through mass tactical parachute formations from C-130 and C-117 aircraft over a possibly contested LZ. But here's the conclusion that all rational and effective parachute formations have arrived at when it comes to landing on an LZ. That LZ must be secure. It cannot be hot. It cannot be contested. And you are going to have a 5 to 7% casualty rate before a heavy drop or after a heavy drop when it comes to the 82nd Airborne, putting a battalion, or worse yet, a brigade on the ground at that uncontested place. That's 5 to 7% where no one's on the ground, completely held by pathfinders. They've secured it, and there is no incoming fire from below on the ground coming in. When I mentioned, by the way, is it inserted after heavy or before the heavy drops, what that means is that all that equipment, to include Humvees, platoon rations, platoon ammunition cargo, pallets, things like that, they come under 1, 2, 3 parachutes, very heavy. You can get crushed by them if you happen to be under them when they make the heavy drop. But if they make the heavy drop beforehand, guess what you can possibly land on as a result of these less than maneuverable chutes that are used in mass tactical formations. For the most part, in my mind, if we had any sense whatsoever, we would decommission the brigade on standby parachute approach for the 82nd Airborne Division and say that you can have a battalion minus total 3-4 companies in which you would have pathfinders and maybe a few more paratroopers, in this case combat arms, who would provide the perimeter support for said pathfinders once they were making the arrangements on the land for air landing by aircraft to bring in the troops. Because it almost seems with the 82nd Airborne Division, and of course this is going to rankle a lot of my 82nd Airborne Confederates in my listening audience, because I'm also about to rankle my Confederates in my air assault ranks, of which I'm an alumnus of 3rd of the 502nd in the 101st Airborne Division, is that it's absolutely impractical in 21st century warfare, even into third world and developing countries. Imagine with the Houthis and the hell that they have been raining upon the carriers and the carrier support armadas in the Red Sea with no naval presence whatsoever to speak of. What would their integrated air and missile defenses, probably augmented by both the Russians and the Iranians, if all of a sudden a decision was made for the 82nd Airborne Division, well, let's say in this case, a brigade component, to parachute in to Yemen proper? How likely is it that the C-130s and C-117 transport aircraft that are going in there, not to mention the refueling aircraft that would have to accompany said armada to drop all of those paratroops onto most likely a contested landing zone, how likely would it be that missiles would go aloft that would intercept these defenseless aircraft and take them out of the air before the first paratroops leave the door? So we must question the efficacy of this 82nd Airborne paratrooper anachronism that just so happens to be sitting astride the 21st century as almost what I would relegate as a museum demonstration project. Another one would be the 101st Airborne Division, the heaviest division in the U.S. Army. Yes, they don't have tanks. Yes, they do have massive hemets, and those hemets are fueling vehicles and rearming vehicles that provide for the FARPs, the forward aerial refueling points, that are necessary for these aircraft to jump from one fueling modality to another to get forward to that forward line of troops that they plan on establishing via these, what was referred to in Vietnam as air mobile, but what is referred to today as air assault, which is heliborne vertical envelopment with troops, which was adopted to a smaller scale by the Marines in order to obviate their failure to have sufficient maritime connectors that were surface-borne to a beach and using helicopters to get to the beach. In this case, what you have, as I mentioned before with the Battle of Karbala against the Iraqis, and this was ground fire only, the loss of so many AH-64s, the same thing will occur here. You will note that the use of rotary wing aircraft in the Ukraine is scarce and scattered, in that in the first few months of that war, in the battle investment by the Russians of Kiev proper, by VDV troops, their paratroops, their air landing troops, their air assault troops and such, disastrous, because manned helicopter insertion, manned helicopters like manned tanks, like aircraft carriers, like all these other exquisite platforms. All of these are presently in the hazard because of the salvo competition that I have breathlessly talked about. So what I'm speaking to here is the totality of all these brigade combat teams and the divisional structures that support them is such that, for the most part, when it comes to near-peer and peer competition, no matter how fantastical, ambitious, and apparently intellectually rigged these transformation initiatives are by the U.S. Army, they are all found wanting. And it is time for responsible folks in the Pentagon, in the defense community, in the greater political community, in the acquisition community, to start asking the hard questions, to ask themselves, so if they are in the hazard on the battlefield, are there any hazards getting these to a foreign battlefield over both the oceans that just so happen, luckily, to surround the United States of America? Because there's this thing called TIPFID, which is time-phased force deployment data. And what that means, these are those exquisite and mathematically inclined planners and logisticians who do all the heavy lifting and the hard work to figure out how do we get all of the forces that I just described into theater safely, effectively, supported, so that they can conduct their combat operations. How is that done? How is that done when all of these modalities are going to be in the hazard trying to get to their ports of debarkation in these theaters that they are implicitly being relied upon to go and engage in? How does that happen in a near peer and peer conflict where all of a sudden, as Van Riper showed us in Millennium Challenge at the turn of the 21st century, I don't have to hit your warriors on the field waiting for them to go ready up and guns up and have everything prepared. I'll hit you at the ports of debarkation. I'll hit you in the ships. I'll hit you at your shipyards. I'll hit you at your embarkation points in CONUS. I'll hit you in all of those places. Logistically, if that were to happen, it would have a twofold effect. Number one, let's suppose that it was embarkation out of San Diego, embarkation out of New Jersey, depending on the Atlantic or the Pacific being used as the shipping and air transport modality to get to the theater of operations. One of those is hit. Two things happen. Number one, they secure and lock down that facility, and all of a sudden, all embarkation operations stop there. And number two, it causes a level of uncertainty in the planning process and the safeguarding process so onerous that all of a sudden, all embarkation details come to a halt. They increase security. Things start to rise to alarming congestion levels. And then with said alarming congestion levels, stuff starts to pile up and becomes very large targets. Like us military folk like to say, when it comes to civil engineering, we think civil engineers build targets. And I want to remind you of another thing too, and that's this. Clancy, if we can say that Tom Clancy was the one who said this, he said that amateurs are concerned with tactics and that professionals are concerned with logistics. I agree with both of those, but my friend Doug Nussbaum out at the Naval Postgraduate School, he adds a third leg to this, and I'm paraphrasing. War winning is built on energy, and this is correct. If you don't have the energy means to make all of these things happen, and a very long lead and long line and deep larder of energy, you will lose, especially when it's projection and expeditionary by its very nature from CONUS to wherever the war front may be around the world. Which brings us to another hope, and that is this. What I'd love to see, besides the re-examination of everything that I've talked about, which means that for the most part, these conventional formations are not going to deliver what they claim they will, is that my whole Fixing Fight Club series has been aimed at one thing and one thing only in the end. That is defense of the homeland, because it has been neglected by the Department of Defense. The DoD does not take its second word in its descriptor very seriously and never has. I've described what happens when it comes to mid-course interceptors in previous episodes concerning nuclear annihilation and incoming IRBMs, ICBMs, and future and very possible hypervelocity munitions that will find themselves on their way into the United States proper, to include Alaska and possibly Hawaii and territories such as Guam and things like that, American defense simply isn't ready for it because America has neglected to do the defense. So what can the Army do for defense? Well, if the Army has THAADs, if the Army has Patriots, if the Army has integrated air and missile defense systems, everything from Manpads, Stingers, everything from the notions of the Javelin and things like that, if they have these, why can't we establish some kind of defensive means in NORTHCOM, the North American Command, that command that apparently, but ostensibly, appears to be not responsible for the defense of the homeland? Why can't that be priority one? Why is it that China can defend with its very sophisticated A2AD, its aerial access, aerial denial program, with their integrated air and missile defenses across the entirety of their western coast, with every inch of Chinese land that touches the Pacific Ocean is protected laterally and in depth? Yet if we took all of those THAADs, Patriots, all of these anti-missile modalities, every one of them in the bloody American inventory, and all of a sudden the American West Coast were threatened, you'd be lucky to protect San Diego County, much less the entire West Coast, maybe British Columbia in Canada, and the entirety of the Alaskan coast. Can't be done, isn't done, won't be done, and there's no prospect for it to be done. There's no defense in DOD. It's all projection. It's all this neo-colonial, which is dressed up as counterinsurgency warfare that's been conducted ad nauseum for the past quarter century, leading to failure, stalemate, and I would say an existential rot in the armed forces because of that question I posed very early in this episode where I said, can an army do two things? Can it conduct both counterinsurgency and these kind of neo-colonial operations and be a peer or near-peer conventional fighter? My answer to that is they cannot be. I'll wait for listeners or readers to inform me that they've found the fix and provide me with the evidence. So here's the case I've made. I've made the case that the Army, that other land warfare Goliath in the U.S. inventory alongside the Marines, is incapable of proper near-peer and peer warfighting. Not simply at the edge, the bleeding edge, the bloody edge of that fight, where they're actually engaged against other combatants of similar pedigree and technology, but getting there is going to be a very large problem indeed that I don't think sufficient intellectual capital has been spent on. This army that I've described, this impotent 20th century dinosaur that I've described, just put in a budget proposal for the fiscal year 2025 presidential budget of $186 billion, approximately 4 times that of the Marine Corps, with 177,000 folks versus the 450,000 folks in the U.S. Army. And I don't know if the bang for the buck that we're getting from this gives us anything more than a jobs program for folks whose martial imagination stopped at the end of World War II. To any incoming Secretary of Defense and Secretary of the Army, let's not have a stand down for extremism. Let's not have a stand down for diversity. Correction, let's have a stand down for diversity. Let's have a stand down where diverse viewpoints from folks like me and others outside of the DoD are entertained, and we take a realistic appraisal of what 21st century revolutions in military affairs and near-peer and peer conflicts look like, salvo competition looks like, and maybe, just maybe, revisit this entire notion of being a global hegemon and scratching our heads and asking ourselves, why is it that regional hegemons who don't necessarily have a hard power ambition to take over the entire world, despite what some folks say, why are they so good at defending their own nations? Why are they so good at projecting military power? As a matter of fact, when you look at the country of Africa, and you've seen that America has waning power and influence on that entire continent, the majority hard power being war, hard power projection is being conducted by the Russians. The reigning soft power, the influence power, the structure power, the power of banking, the power of infrastructure building, the power of influence, the power of creating political alliances and negotiable franchises. That's what China. And China and Russia happen to be aligned with each other. As a matter of fact, in the 21st century, if America doesn't pay attention, its alleged supremacy in the world as a global hegemon is coming to a rapid close. In the next 10, 20 years, that door can be closed forever. It's time to reassess, realign, take a knee, and reconsider America's Army's place in the world and what land warfare looks like realistically, and not just the cheap ambition of new exquisite platforms, much more spending, and ineffective martial imagination that puts America in the hazard. So I look forward to your feedback, your comments, and such. You can reach me on my Substack. You can reach me at cgpodcast@pm.me. That is cgpodcast@pm.me. I really appreciate your listenership if you made it this far. If you can take the time to leave a review on the podcast provider of your choice, or just write me, let me know how I'm doing, maybe subjects for future presentations and discussions. And also, the following 2 episodes will cover the Navy and Air Force respectively. Then I will take a knee and take a decision on whether I will continue this particular series before returning to chasing ghosts. But I thought that elections have consequences, and while I am a member of neither party, I see the possibilities of a military and martial renaissance and rethinking in the new administration, and hold out hope that maybe a few folks can listen to this series and it can provide food for thought on what to do at the fork of the road before us. This is Bill, out.